For those of you who are wondering, the actual decision to go mono or stereo in real life audio is really based upon mic placement, how many mics you have, and really how you're going to capture the source, and what source is really involved. Now, to talk about this, just to give you an idea, if you only have one mic, mono all day, obviously, right? But what happens when you do have stereo mics, a matching set that's pretty awesome? When do you really make the call to track in stereo? When do you make the call to track mono? Realistically, your call and your decision is going to be based upon a couple of factors. One factor will be, what is the outcome mixdown going to look like in terms of placement? One thing I strongly emphasize before I get into that, one thing I strongly emphasize is this. You have been taught up to this point that two sets of waveforms at the same volume in reverse polarity do what? Cancel each other out, create phase cancellation. Okay, and there's a lot of conversations about this. I like talking about this because it's actually, well, long story. Okay, I'll tell you in a second. Here's what happens. Phase cancellation will only realistically be a possibility when you have the same source playing twice on, in this version here in Pro Tools. If it ever exists twice in this session where there's a reverse polarity, like at the exact moment there's a reverse polarity. In the real world, though, phase cancellation looks a little different because the receiver that we're using in the real world could be lots of different things. If we're doing live mixing, it's when they arrive at the console. You see what I'm saying? In Pro Tools, it's when they get to Pro Tools and then when we play them back. So we could actually have phase cancellation take place and then we could just mute one channel and there goes our phase cancellation. It's not a big deal. Or we could use a plugin and do phase inversion. But in a live, realistic live setting, phase is kind of one of those things where the reality of it is you would not have had a phase issue. So you tracking with me on this one? You would not have had a phase issue if you were mono. Did you catch that? So phasing doesn't really give you problems in a mono format unless you take two mono, which of course you shouldn't have done in the first place, but if you take two mono sources and they're the same source and they're inverted at the same time. So, you know, that's the only other real situation. But if you're going mono on a single source, on a single mic, you'll never encounter phase cancellation. So when the decision is made to go stereo, one thing has to take place. The question has to be, when I mix down, is this an item that's going to go here? I'm pretending I'm the panner. Is it going to go like this? Okay? On a mono form? Or is it going to go like this? Left, right? Follow me with left, right here. Hard left, right? Or this way, left, right? I guess it's going to stay this way, left, right. Or this way, left, right. It'd still be left, right. Even this would be left, right. It would just be the grouping of them and where they end up getting panned. So that's the real question, is what are you going to do with placement? There are a couple things you'll talk about in mixing about kick placement, snare placement, all that stuff about who gets mono and who gets stereo and all that fun stuff. Well, here's the real problem. So here's the new lesson if you haven't learned this yet. If I have the same source with polarity correct, you got me on this one? So the polarity is not inverted, the polarity is correct. Polarity is the same on a left and a right channel. Essentially, if I'm the same distance from the source with the microphones at the same level, and I'm hard pan left and right in a stereo format, I am equivalent to dead center mono. Did you catch me on that? So if I mic up something in very close proximity and I go hard left, hard right, same distance, same volume, same source, the only thing I can really seek to capture out of getting that in a left-right form is one of two things. So follow me on this. The only reason I might do stereo is for movement, because movement will add more left or more right. Great example, acoustic guitar, a little bit of spacing on a stereo pair. you'll hear the difference between what's going on with the strings, sliding. Some people like to do the nut at the top of the neck, and they'll just do the neck plus the sound pole, and that'll be their left right. And they'll balance it out so it's still even, because it'll be a little shifted towards the sound pole because it'll be louder, but it'll feel like movement. Does that make sense? Piano, great example. Left, right, because low hand, high hand. Does that make sense? Movement, right? Shaker, which I don't remember who I was talking about with this, but shaker essentially is something that you can do in stereo because when you shake it, it will have movement. Drums always have a lot of stereo imaging because of the fact that there's some stuff over here and there's some stuff over there. You catch what I'm saying here? But if you're literally going to have a vocal, for example, a vocal, it gets recorded typically in mono, or it can be dual mic, but they'll be dual mic mono. Meaning they're not going to be mixed hard left, hard right. Or, and now here's where it gets into effects and filtering and all that kind of stuff. What they'll do is they'll track a mono, they'll use a mono source, plus they'll split it in Pro Tools after the fact, do some duplicates, throw one left, throw one right, make a difference in time where they can feel broader. And then not only is there a center image, but there is a stereo left, right image. And it's not complicated, but that's just a further thought process. But the reason why vocals are not normally tracked, here I am left, here I am right, is because there's no movement. Do you get what I'm saying? The vocalist isn't going to go like this. You're not going to want that effect for the most part in most of your recordings. And so when you make a decision in the real world with live audio, stereo and mono is based upon your outcomes, your goals, and all that kind of stuff. Now, walk with me in your thought process and move to virtual instruments. What is a virtual instrument made of? There's only really two main components two options. It's either A or it's B. It's either, a virtual instrument is either A, how many of you have done 235? Audio 235? No? Okay, well, you will, and you'll learn this to your eyes bleed.
A synthesizer?
Essentially, a synthesizer, which synthesizers technically are just sound oscillators, meaning pure sound waves that have been manipulated, or they might have been there's more complex forms of them, but essentially it's a sound source that's been manipulated with the A, D, S, and R, meaning what? A? Attack. Initial decay, sustain, and release, right? So the envelope has been modified to make it sound like something, okay? So if you wanted it to sound like a piano, it has to have a certain amount of attack because there's a hammer in a piano. Does that make sense? If you want it to sound like strings, the attack's got to be a little elongated. Sustain's got to be elongated. Release has got to be, pretty much everything gets elongated in a making up strings from a synthesizer format. All right, and so it's either a synthesizer formatted event. Got me there? Or it's a sample event, which is a lot of what's going on these days. And I'm a big fan of, I use it all the time. I teach the advanced synthesis class, and we do sampling all day in that class. But essentially what happens is, the reason I bring that up is either the item has been generated, and it was generated in a mono form from synthesis, and piped down, so catch me on this, piped down some sort of reverb or delay that would split to stereo. Meaning it might actually go when you play it. It might have this space. Then, if that's the sound I'm using, I want my virtual instrument to be stereo. You caught me on that? If my virtual instrument is just playing samples of a kick, I probably don't need it stereo. We all say, yes, sir.
Have you ever used the pod before?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And what would that be? What would you use?
Well, depends on what I'll do pod bass mono. I'll do pod guitar if it has effects on it, stereo. But let me preface that with this. Depends on what I'm doing with the sound. Because when I run delay, if I run delay, I'll run a single guitar on delay instead of duals. Run a single guitar tracking with a stereo dual left and right so I can hear the space. But if I'm not running delays, I'll track it twice, one for left, one for right. And the difference in time between the fact that they're not going to be 100% perfect will make it feel like it's bigger, and then I'll run them on. It's a great question. Did you have a question as well?
No, well I did, but I got to figure it out.
Okay. So, if you're looking at your tracking, because you may not have ever been explained to this at all, and so you might not have gone through this process. if you're going through your process here and you're looking at this going, okay, what should I do? Mono or stereo? Your question's really, what is my source and what am I planning to use and how will I mix it down? Does that make sense? Yes, sir.
Alright, so if you're in mono and you're playing the sound and you record it and it's supposed to be stereo, is it gonna sound different or?
If you were supposed to have recorded it in stereo?
Yeah.
Let's just say this. Okay, let's say this. You guys, I do have a wonderful announcement to make later on in class today, which will be awesome for all of us, about our involvement with Extreme Thing and how our particular class will be involved. Long story short, I've done a lot of, we're going to be doing live recording at our stage at Extreme Thing, which some of you may not even know what that is, but some of you may know what that is. I've done a lot of live recording in my day, and one thing I was looking at with my track list for this event, and I was looking at it going, I might be a little limited with some of the mics that I can take out into the field, only because of the fact that I know that we're just trying to avoid any possible destruction of any of our gear. So the least I can take, the better, but I need a lot of stuff already. So in picking crab mics, I was sitting down today and I was going, man, stereo or mono, I'm really gonna kill myself. I'm really gonna kick myself if I go mono and I could have gone, I'll just be sitting there going, dang, if I would have just gone stereo. The real difference is for a stereo source that goes mono, for some instances, it literally will take away your ability to have a natural presence in terms of space. And by natural, I mean unmanipulated. When I do crab mics, I've done certain crowd interaction things with crab mics, and I had one particular event that I did, it was like 1,500 people, and I ended up doing 6 crab mics because the place was that big, and I wanted to catch every angle of it, and so I did. And literally what it sounded like was when you sat in front of the speakers and listened to just the crowd applaud at the end of each set, or at the end of each song, you just felt like you were getting poured on by rain. The difference with that in mono is that in the stereo field, you get this feeling like there's a distinct sound happening here and it's fluctuating, and there's a distinct sound happening here and it's fluctuating. In the mono form, it's still distinct. It's just there's no fluctuation between left and right. I will give you this. In the instance that you ever, so catch me on this, in the instance that you ever accidentally, or maybe not by accident, but by function or by limitation, track something in mono, and you do want to make it feel stereo. Reverb is your first go-to, but essentially there are a couple other means to getting around keeping it in a mono form and using it in a hard left, hard right situation. One of those is to use a delay in line with the source. And in the delay, you're basically going to say the delay will be 100% for both left and right, but the millisecond timing, I don't know, how many of you know anything about delay? You should have talked about this in your previous classes in terms of what it is. How it really works is essentially all it's going to do is it's going to hold for milliseconds of time. It will then, after the initial time you gave it, will release the information and obviously repeat it. Well, at its heart, delay, how many of you guys are interested in live? Because you guys don't need to know this. No one's interested in live? Some of you guys are interested in live? Okay. I worked at a church for a while, and it was a big giant steeple, like the steeple kind of church. And it was probably 250 feet from stage to the back balcony. And that's where they put the sound perch. And I was actually still in college, just getting out of college when I was working at this church doing sound. Well, from a delay standpoint, for live, you'll learn a lot about delay stuff from the live perspective in the live class. But essentially, they built sound boxes from all the way up at the stage where they normally are, all the way back down, probably about every 40 feet or so. And then they had, speakers up in the balcony. Well, problem is, from a long time ago, if those speakers fire at the same time, the distance from the speaker that's way on stage to the speaker that's here will make it make me hear the ones in front of me closest to me first. And then sound has to travel from the midway and then all the way from the stage. Meaning I'll hear for every box that's there and every, whatever, how many boxes series there were there, that's how many essentially echoes I will hear on my way to me. And it's milliseconds, but it's enough to tell. It makes it feel like you're in like a high school gym kind of feel. See what I'm saying? And it makes it inaudible. So at the initial onset, delay in a lot of settings doesn't get used as hey, 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 hey. No, it actually gets used as a withholding of just the source content until it needs to be released. The fix for it in live means that what happens is they take the farthest away speaker from the stage. This is how it works. They take the farthest away speaker from the stage, and they basically stand in front of it. And they calculate, there's one way, you can calculate footage. You go online, you'll see the whole spread for footage. Or you can literally just do it by ear. And essentially what you're doing is you're trying to make the box in front of you, it'll fire at the onset of something, right? Like a kick or a snare, good thing to use. But the farthest box away has to be managed and put on a delay, even though it'll be the front one that everybody in the front will hear. It'll be milliseconds. It'll be under 100 milliseconds, typically. Not enough for anybody in front of the stage to ever notice that there's even any delay in time. But what it'll mean is, if you turned your back on the stage and walked from the stage to the very back of the room, you'll only hear one shot of audio. Does that make sense? At every stage in the walk. Well, in this mono split to stereo, all we're going to do is keep the source, the original source, hard left, 100% mix, but 0 delay. And then we'll take the right side and we'll say, hey, we just want you slightly delayed. So maybe literally like 0.2, so I mean, it's literally like 20 to 50 milliseconds is good enough to keep it from feeling like it's out of phase. And then essentially it will begin to go from here as you spread it out in time, it'll just go straight out here.
So it doesn't make it sound like you're in like a big stadium.
Yeah, it won't make it, essentially
It's
it
just
won't.
like delay like that.
It's just a single instance.
Ah, cool.
It's a single instance, and I've had to do it a lot, and I actually had to do it recently. I did it recently because I was doing a stereo miking situation, and I had to cancel out the stereo mic because every time, my spread was so wide this way and this way, every time I was this way, on the source that was over here, all I heard on the other mic was echo. So in the stereo field, I hear direct source here, that's great, but this one just echoing like crazy. And I just needed it to be tighter. I needed it to be faster. I needed it to be controlled, And so instead I said, all right, I'll stick with the mono source from this side, and every time I go this way, I'll stick with the mono source when it goes to this side, cut them up, split them up that way, because now I can go under 50 milliseconds is the longest delay that I'm ever going to hear, which is awesome because now I have more control, and if I want reverb, hey, there it is, right? So, good question. The other side of the coin here with this is the problem that you'll run into is if you decide to go stereo when you should have gone mono, you have to essentially, you'll keep the tracking, but you'll want to combine it. But again, like in my situation, it takes more work to have to go in and you know what I'm saying? If I had just gone, you know what, let's just go tight. The other problem with delay is distance. A lot of times distance is the factor that will give you more of that room sound anyway. Again, application is big and key, but in this situation, we're going to operate, most of the time we'll operate stereo to get the stereo effects, but if you're running like kick and snare and hat and things like that, especially if you're doing individual components, if you had like 10 virtual instruments and they're all just one part of the drum set, you're normally going to want to keep mono and do the pans so that they're individual pans. And then you'll probably want to actually run that as a whole, run that through a stereo reverb, because the stereo reverb and a reverb, in essence, a reverb is only supposed to create the acoustic environment, right? Well, guess what? If you're going to create an acoustic environment, you probably want to feel like you're using your ears, which are in fact stereo and not in mono, which means that you will actually want to have the reverb field be in stereo. Do you get what I'm saying? Probably the single most important thing that ties everything in. That's why vocals will go mono all day, because they can get away with it, because guess what? They usually have a lot of reverb on them. I mean, they don't have so much that's annoying, but they'll also have delay, which will still be operable in stereo. They'll sometimes have chorus or some other effect, and it's in stereo. It's not in a mono format. The real problem with mono, essentially, is that you are on a mix down premise are given only a couple of options of how to mix and give things an individual sound. Number one, frequency manipulation, so EQing and all that stuff. Processing through dynamic manipulation, compression, limiting, all that stuff. Balance for volume, but panning is huge, you know, and once you, and you know, I mean, you ever hit the mono button on your little interface, and you all of a sudden hear your stuff, what it sounds like when it's not in stereo, it's drastic, you know. So anyway, so far, we're all here. We need to look at this, and we've talked about this, but down at the bottom, we go down and make sure we check instrument. Gosh, I feel like I'm always so hopped up by the time I get to you guys in the evening class. I had a good day today. Today, well, it's so funny. I guess it wasn't the greatest day. But, today, I actually just I had my sampling class this morning. We did a bunch of recycled cut-ups and making all sorts of sequences with compositional style sampling. But then I went home and I tuned my piano, which sounds fantastic now. So I'm just all hopped up and ready to go back home and start playing on it. And so if I'm jittery or just talking a lot, I did also suck down a bunch of coffee before I came. So check this out. What is this? We had a conversation about this already. Pro Tools, I wish you guys could see it. I mean, you could probably look it up and see what it looked like. Pro Tools, I started on 5, okay? 5, I was on 6, I was on 7, probably 5 through 7, even 8. 5 through 7 looks like Atari compared to what we're doing now. We used to not even have half of this right here. We had to go to the, and I don't know if you guys know much about the audio MIDI setup engine within Apple, within the actual Mac system. That used to be the only place we get to decide this information. Now they made it integrated into this, so life is easy. But this is what? What is this section that says instrument?
Pan, volume, and then you could select the, you predefine what you want to play in.
Okay, yes.
What controller you're using?
Yeah.
Yes.
What,
Go ahead.
And what
I was like, what was the question again?
What is this? This essentially, let me tell you, I'll tell you.
Is it ins and outs?
Yes, MIDI I/O.
Yeah.
This is MIDI I/O. Where's your audio I/O? On the mix window.
It's above the.
Yeah,
Below the settings. Right?
yeah. I mean, it's essentially, you can see it grouped over here with its own panners and all this stuff. There's your audio I/O. This essentially is your MIDI I/O, but it works, it's a pretty impressive thing, okay? There are a couple functions about it that I wanted to have you know so that we can get through these so that you know that you know that you know these. Because to be honest with you, once you understand this, how many of you know how to push record on your Pro Tools system? Okay, and how many of you now know how to use takes in Pro Tools? Right? Now, just FYI, takes are in the book, so if you're, known as playlists, but if you're confused on that, you can go back and look it up and go through it. Now, from the tracking part, in the creative series of what we do, there really only is recording, audio, and recording MIDI. You see what I'm saying? So, MIDI is probably the most complex function just because it's awkwardly quirky and there's a couple of systems that you have to go through in order to make it operate. So this is the I/O. Now I want you to write this down because there are a couple of things that are contingent upon this I/O working. So in order for the MIDI I/O to work correctly, meaning in order for me to go up to this list and make it do what I want, you got that? So in order for this to work, I have to have a couple of things activated in the menu system. Under options, I have to have MIDI through selected. So this is for the whole MIDI I/O to be operable at 100%. MIDI through essentially means that the information that's going to be sent from the keyboard controller that you're going to use to go into Pro Tools will be sent out of Pro Tools either into a virtual instrument or to an external device. Meaning it will actually send the information. Otherwise, it'll hold on to the information all day and it won't do anything with it. And there's a shoot. Okay, here we go. I want to build just to give you an idea why this exists, okay? I'm going to build hovercrafts so that instead of using cars, we're going to use hovercrafts. So no more driving on the streets, no more any of that kind of crap, okay? There's a certain degree of stuff I'm going to have to include in the first versions and even into the 10th generation of hovercrafts that will be somewhat parallel to what you're used to in a car. Meaning if you go buy a hovercraft and it doesn't have an iPod adapter, you'll probably just get a car instead, right? I mean, realistically, you're like, how am I going to play my tunes? You know, if it didn't have a stereo, if it didn't have a stereo, would you even buy it? Well, unfortunately, there are some things that they built into this that are not our generation's thing at all. That we didn't, if it was up to us, it wouldn't exist because we always use it in that form. MIDI through essentially is the 80s MIDI generation where they used to always turn it on and turn it off, and turn it on and turn it off. And the reason being is sometimes they want to fire things and they want to use MIDI, and sometimes they just want it to be there but be off. Yeah, okay. So that's why it's there, okay? But it needs to be selected. By default, it usually is not. So you have to make sure that this is selected. Check this out. Go to Setup. Go to MIDI. And when you go to this MIDI breakdown, please go to Input Devices. So everybody should have a list. It doesn't look like this because yours will say Inbox Pro, and it will call to those. But essentially, this is MIDI. We talked about the MIDI I/O. These things have to be activated on this list in order for them to count. Does that make sense? So if they're not on this list, and they exist in one shape or form, guess what? We're not going to be able to use them. Do you follow me on that part? Now, where this really gets its heart and soul is essentially all the way back to, well, two things. Plug and play for Mac, which essentially means you just grab a controller, you throw it in there, and all of a sudden it knows who it is. But when you're looking at these kinds of ports, this is an interface option. So the interface itself would have to, in this instance, actually have to show some sort of MIDI capabilities. And it does for the O3, it does for the Inbox Pro, it does for a lot of other interfaces, but that actually would have to show in order to give you that information. So here's the downside. These ports, okay, this Axiom Pro 25, Axiom Pro USB-A in. The USB-A in is not an open port. So follow with me on this. The USB-A in is not just necessarily an open port. Had this been any other controller, it would just say that controller USB in. And that controller, all it's saying is, hey, that particular input is direct from this particular controller. You got me on that? So when you see hypercontrol on this controller, and it's called different on different controllers, is all that other transport stuff, the knobs, all the other functions you see up and above on the Axiom there. So all that information is there, but essentially this has to be active for any of the I/O to work at all. From here, there are a few other things in MIDI that you should be aware of. The MIDI Studio is where the configuration for devices that are actually manually connected to MIDI get routed. So back in the back, I have the Nord lead. It actually has MIDI lines tied into the Digio 3. In order to use this as a MIDI controller, I actually have to take what is represented as MIDI in and out and patch it. Even though it's already plugged in, I have to virtually patch it so it knows, hey, there's another device there. I know it's kind of sucky, but that still is one function. What you may not have realized is the M-Audio units actually have MIDI in and out. These Axiom Pros, on the back of them there is a MIDI in and out, and you can see it in this one. MIDI in and out. You can actually, and that's why you see that. See where it says Axiom Pro 25? It shows 1, 2, 3, 4. Essentially, you can route for MIDI in and out, essentially extra MIDI in and out. You could plug in extra devices via MIDI to this, and it'll communicate with this as long as you patch it in. The book kind of talks a little bit about this, but one of the things I wanted to mention as well while we're here looking at this is there is something, again, taking it back to old school, but these again are those functions that a lot of guys like to see that handle MIDI, that have been used to the old way of MIDI instead of the new way of MIDI, where any of you are Reason guys, you probably realize a lot of these functions can just be automatable right off the cuff. As soon as you start hitting record, you start tracking everything you touch. But this gives you the ability to say, hey, I want to record the following things, but I want to exclude the following things. So if none of these are checked, essentially if we didn't have any of these checked, these would not be recorded on the first pass. They could be automated later, but they would not be recorded with the data. Meaning you could screw around your mod wheel all day, but it won't track it. Which kind of seems like a bad thing, but sometimes from a complex situation, MIDI at its simplest is you in a room by yourself recording some MIDI data. But MIDI at its most crazy is a whole series of keyboards that we don't want to accidentally have our cat come in and just walk across a keyboard while we're recording for something else, and since they're all linked together, accidentally record pitch bend where we didn't mean for it to exist. Or live on stage, if we're doing this information live on stage, we don't want any information to be activated via another controller on accident. And so you'll see a lot of weird things where you can disengage information. So that's this, okay? Now if we look at the I/O, let's look at this. You'll see it says all. All meaning, and I talked about this last week. Give me a hand. Someone that hasn't answered any questions today. You guys are probably good. Maybe one of you two. You want to answer me a question here? Volunteer some information, some knowledge?
Yes, what is it?
Okay. What does all mean in the I/O? This is the input. The top being the input. All means what?
All the interface of
Okay. Give me an example.
like the inbox. So
Okay. Close. Close. Think MIDI.
or the keyboard.
Okay. Now we're on the right track. What all is, and the reason that it's functional in this way is it's realistically the MIDI input for dummies. Okay. All means if the computer's basically laying out saying, hey, and it's also known as Omni. Okay, so you'll see it listed as Omni in other DAWs or other situations, but essentially it's saying, hey, if any MIDI data comes my way, dude, I'm catching it and I'm going to use it for this channel. Does that make sense? Great examples of when to use that. If you only have one controller, that's when you should use it. And because it's easy. If you only have one controller, it's pretty obvious that there's only going to be one keyboard that will be playing as the input for every different VI we use, right? For every different situation, there'll just be one keyboard, right? You catch me on that? But when you have more than one, when we start linking up more than one, and there's a lot of reasons why we might want to do more than one. So for some of you who haven't really ventured into that, more than one would be, oh, great idea, okay. I use the M-Audio Key Station 49. I also have an old, what's it called? It's a pad control, I think, or something like that. I don't know. A buddy of mine gave me, it's like, hey, I'm not using this. It's one of those, 4x4 matrix pad units. And I only use it for certain things. I can do so much more without it, but every now and then I do use it, which is cool. Just to do a little XY kind of action to some of my automation. But when I have dual units on, now anything I do on this one will do something on the channel. If I have all selected, it will. Anything I do on one of them will do it to the channel that it's coming in on. Anything I do to the other one will still do it to the same channel. You see what I'm saying? There's no isolation between the two. So if I ever wanted to, and great for live situations, because the more computing power we have, the more we can use Pro Tools Live, realistic. Or in any other, this kind of carries over to Live and Reason and Logic, and all those other DAWs, where essentially you want to put two guys on a stage running off the same computer, not a problem. Give them both their own controller, give them both their own ability to select their devices, which can actually be automated, and you can tell your controllers how to select their own devices. And then just essentially say, okay, well, all of these are going to be listed as your predefined device instead of just all, because otherwise if it was all, it just takes everything. You get me on that so far? So when we look at this predefined list, what we see here is we see the listing for each of these things. And if we just look at the Digio 3 port, we'll see all 16 channels. Well, guess what? This has an all feature as well. So at the top of the tier, we're looking at any MIDI device information at all. As soon as we go into predefined, we go Digio 3 port 3. If we select all here, it's going to take all channels from the MIDI that's coming in. So now it breaks down even further. So we could technically, we could use, because of how many ports we actually have that will be in use, and there's one more external which will come off of the back of the Nord. We could use all 16 of these individually. We could use 16 of each of these individually, 16 of the external individually. Before you know it, we're blown up with MIDI channels that are operable. It used to be, well, and they haven't really changed a whole lot. Typically in a standard Pro Tools session, you could use up to 256 MIDI channels simultaneously. It's been like that since I was using Pro Tools. They had, I think, in this new update, rolled out some plan to jump up to something insane like, and I only mean these channels, not like individual tracks. I mean like, you can route for this many channels at one given time. I think it was something like 900 and something, and it capped off, and they were like, we're not going to add any more probably ever, because why the heck would we need to? Who even uses that, you know, in this format? And that might be your question, and here's your answer. Through each MIDI line, whether it's USB or it is an actual MIDI cable, if we linked 16 different devices up together, and they all had different sounds embedded in their devices, we could tell each of them to have their own isolated channel that would recall this information, and that's where this 1 through 16 comes from. So we could break down very, very far and say, hey, this controller over here is going to be on channel 15, which means anytime any MIDI data on a track that says output to channel 15 ever fires, it'll go through this thing, and this thing might only be used once, and there it goes. So that's the I/O in a nutshell. The only other side you have to look at, or keep in mind, is that down here at the bottom, you'll have your output. And your output actually can go out externally as long as you have a MIDI out. So if you ever have a MIDI out, you can technically route that MIDI data out to whatever the heck you want. It could be lighting, it could be, you know, a robot that builds cars. I mean, it could be whatever the heck is receiving MIDI. And a lot of times, you'll see MIDI being used for syncing. You'll see MIDI used for external device elements, which, I don't remember if this class actually, I don't think I do, but it's a long conversation. Anyway, so all this is here for external use. But with virtual instruments, with the advent of virtual instruments, now we can use it internally. And just a few other things real quick. You can see a very basic pan. That's only, now here's what's kind of weird. This is where it gets weird, okay? This panner is exclusive to panning MIDI data only. So when the instrument comes through, we can specify MIDI data to go to a specific left or right channel, especially if we had two different things going on from left to right. That's totally cool. Otherwise, we don't need this. We can pan at the final outcome. You see what I'm saying? And it's only an extra option there. The mute function is added so that if you were like, hey, you push play, and I've been on these. You know, I've worked with a lot of people that have done advanced sequencing with a bunch of keyboards. We're sitting there pushing play, and we're like, there's a vocal soloed, and all we hear is this stupid drum sample off of this keyboard. We don't understand why. MIDI keeps firing it. Blah, 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 blah. That's where the mute function on the MIDI routing comes in. It's essentially saying, hey, we don't want MIDI info coming into our system at all, period. Just shut it off without having to go through option field and uncheck stuff. Does that make sense? So real quick, yeah, off this one.
How do you get that 3D control in
Oh, down at the bottom, select instrument. Just so you know, if you were all at all confused, if you go to view in the menu system, you'll see that a whole breakdown of view, whatever the heck you can see, exists here. Where and we have some of these things we will talk about more later, but automation, your sends, your track numbers, and then when it shows you this up top, it'll say the edit window shows the following. The mix window will show the following. So each of these things that you see down at the bottom that look like this also have the option to be selected in this window. To make life kind of easy, but I never use it. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a virtual instrument. And I know it took me a while to get through that, but let's just go ahead and make a mini grand just to make it easy. We'll be all on the same page, and we can decide to screw around with all sorts of wonderful things after this. And I just want to show you a little bit of how this would work out in real life at its most advanced. And someone let me know when it's 7:30, because yeah, you know me. All right, now watch what I'm going to do. Don't do this, but watch. I'm going to open Reason, and I'm only going to open Reason for one particular reason, and it's not to network at this point in time. What it will be to do is to see if I can find one. Oh, actually, you know what? Okay. Now, I'm only going to use this as an example of what can be done as far as what is actually happening in terms of data use, stuff like that. Let me see if I can find. Sorry, let me open another section.
What was number 2 on that loop record?
Who?
Number 2 on loop records?
Oh, it was make a selection. Sorry, I didn't write it down. Eros, can you do me a favor? Throw that up there. Yeah, just put yeah, just put make selection. You could fly, you could do it free floated, but you'll be honest. I'll be honest. Grid mode will save you, because what it'll do is when it comes back around again, it'll sound fluid. It'll just sound like you kept going. Otherwise, you're gonna have to stop and start and try to catch up with what's going on. Now, if you had a long enough section, that probably wouldn't be a problem. You see what I'm saying? But if it's a section that requires you to and very quickly in time be doing something or recording again, you probably want to be able to keep with the tempo or some sort of beat. If you had loops, you could if you weren't using bars of beat, but you still had loops, you could essentially highlight where the loop starts and where the loop ends in order to still catch it in time. It just helps. I find that it just makes it faster instead of getting confused. Let's see, what did I do today? Oh, what's this one? All right, what I'm going to do in here, which would be much like using this in any other format, if you guys had any other type of sequencer, Fruity Loops, machine, all that kind of fun stuff, you guys could essentially use them standalone and still just, if you ever wanted to, for any crazy reason, and I do this it comes and goes, you know. Sometimes I need it, sometimes I don't, sometimes I don't want to mess with it. But essentially all I'm going to do is I'm exporting my MIDI. I'm going to go and import that MIDI that I just exported from Reason, and I'm going to bring it in for my mini grand. And I'm going to do this so I want to show you something kind of specific about what the routing looks like for this and what will actually take place. Let's see, new track clip list. I'm going to pick clip list. Drag and drop. Okay, now this will probably sound silly because what I was building earlier was a sample. Okay, what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to go ahead and create, and watch what happens. I'm going to create a new instrument track. So I'm going to go through, make another instrument track. I'm going to make it stereo. For you guys, while I'm doing this, why don't you go ahead and just record on your keyboard into your MIDI track. Just record a couple bars, maybe 4 bars real quick. Just hit record, start recording. Just do whatever you need to, just bang on it, hit some pads, play some ditties. Just do it real quick and raise your hand when you've got it and you've recorded, because you're going to need just a touch of data. For me, it's just easier to do this than have to go back and record it. Adapter? Good? Yeah? Good? You good? Let's do it. Yeah, once you're done recording, please create a new instrument track, but do not put anything on it. Just wait for me there. Anybody not done with the recording? Heck yeah, look at that. Put that thing somewhere accessible, huh? Okay, here's what we're gonna do. On your new track, please select for me a multi-channel virtual instrument, another one, but on this one, let's go ahead and use something kind of fun. Either vacuum, expand, preferably not boom for this instance. Just something that's going to make some noise on a normal kind of synthesis or keyboard basis. All right, so everybody has something on their second track, correct?
Yeah.
Everybody's good? You guys, this whole row? Yeah? Okay, so here's what I want to show you. Up at the top, you see the input listed as all, right? What can happen here is there's actually a number of things. But this routing, if we do it correct, now I'm going to show you this for 2 reasons. Okay? 2 reasons I'm going to show you this is, 1, you may run into an issue where this becomes a problem, where it wasn't set up correctly and you have to fix it. 2, this might just be something you want to do just to hear what things might sound like without having to go crazy and make a whole bunch of duplicates of the track. If we wanted to have the vacuum play what was on our first track, MIDI-wise, we could just copy, paste onto the new track. Pretty easy, right? Okay, now, but But notice, what else we could do is on the output of our first track, we are now given with our second instrument, we're listing the actual new virtual instrument. So if I push play now, let me fix this real quick. All right, everybody see this working out? Now, question, who is the audio output source in terms of which track channel gets the final outcome, meaning the final fader, the final panner? Who actually is in control of what's happening on the output now? Yeah, well, instrument track 2, essentially. The expand will be the sound engine, but now the overriding control of volume and information and all that kind of stuff is going to be who? Instrument 2. So, here's what's interesting. Even though this is the source, muting right here will not shut this off. You see that? Where we would have to mute, and of course this is one reason why it's included there, is up at the top where we're actually getting the incoming data, right, from the other particular track, or the actual data from the initial source. But one of the problems we run into is the good news is we can mix and match at any time. You guys kind of seeing what's going on here with this? Which is great. And it's great for a lot of reasons.
You don't have to open it. Then you'll have a line of instruments and stuff.
Yeah, yes. And if you haven't noticed, virtual instruments are the largest thing that you'll encounter in Pro Tools. The newest updated version of the virtual instrument package was like 6 gigs or something ridiculous. Whereas the Pro Tools software itself was like 2. You know, and there's just a lot of information going on there. They include a lot of loops and a lot of features, but it's essentially the most weighty thing on here, which does give you the ability to do this, realistically. Let's see here. Oh, I know what I want to do. Here we go. I'll do it like this. Now, this particular thing, let's see. I could really use this as an instrument track or MIDI, and I'm going to show you the difference. This is what I'm going to do, and I'll just show this to you, and then you can just check it out and understand. All right? What I'm going to do with my instrument tracks, I just created a whole slew of them. I mean, only 4, but a slew. To me, it's a slew, okay? What I'm going to do with them is on their output for the instrument output, I'm going to make all of these go to the vacuum. So I'm only going to have one vacuum virtual instrument. I'm going to have all these guys go to the vacuum. And then over here, where it's just MIDI, the real difference between MIDI and instrument is this. A MIDI track doesn't carry the ability to have an onboard internal virtual instrument. But guess what? That doesn't keep it from routing to a virtual instrument. Because MIDI, when we just run MIDI by itself, MIDI's only I/O that you see down here, this I/O that is essentially what we know as the audio I/O, is now listing as a hardware MIDI I/O for MIDI tracks. So because MIDI is data, we don't actually need a MIDI output. Notice for virtual instruments, we actually do need an audio output because normally they'll have a plug-in. You get what I'm saying? So because they'll have a plug-in that'll have an audio output, it needs an audio output. But since MIDI doesn't have an audio output, since there is no audio attached to it, it's just data, all it needs on its I/O is the same thing you see up at the top for the instrument, which is now MIDI I/O. It says all, and it also says the listings for who's included from before. So what this really means is, I can go over here, and I'm just going to actually copy this, and I don't know how many, oops. Okay. I'm going to start on my first instrument track, and I will actually get to my keyboard for this one. All right, interesting news about this. Because of the way mine is wired, I have not only the Axiom, but I do actually have a physical unit that will actually send MIDI information. Because this is hardwired with a regular old school MIDI cable. So I do not only have the ability to use that as a controller, once this thing fires. Now, good news is I can use all of these channels to record essentially the same, off of the same virtual instrument. The bad news is it will all sound the same because it's all the same virtual instrument. So here we go. All right, so we just did that guy. Let's go down here and let's try a MIDI one, huh? Okay, so at the end of the day, what we're really seeing here is what?
This.
Yeah, well, sequencing with one virtual instrument, right? With one set of routing. Are you guys kind of following me on this? The reason I'm showing you this is because the most advanced thing that you're realistically going to work with, you guys will do step input, which we did last week. You guys remember that, step input? You guys will do quantizing. Most of you know quantizing. I'll show you one more time quantizing, and there's some things you can do with quantizing again. But you guys understand the most of that. What you probably haven't dealt a lot with is essentially the networking or the creative side of it, because this is really where you're going to use it. This essentially will be the heart and soul of how you use it. Really cool factor about why this is awesome. Do you know why this is really awesome? Tell me why MIDI is such a great thing to use. Other than quantizing and editing for performance, what's real amazing about it? What does it give us the ability to do that if we track live audio? If we went and took this and just played it out of, yes.
Change your instrument.
Change your instrument on the fly at any given time. Make any changes to the sound. If we don't like this synth thing, we're like, hey guys, synth is dead. People don't use that anymore. You know. Now it's all everything has to be like a penny whistle. Okay, that's the new cool thing. Okay. So if we just find samples of that, once rock, right? I don't know what decade that would ever happen in, but essentially, you see where I'm going with this. Now watch this, because this is where now we get to see the external effect. The external effect shows us this factor, and essentially what it is now what else can we do? Remember that whole idea? What else can we do? I'm going to get rid of this channel because it's kind of annoying. But what else can we do is, hey, we can also go out. If I pick the right port, I think it might be, it's either port 1 or port 3, and use an external device, which is over here, this Nord lead. All I have to do is route back an aux in and use it as an aux so it's not the track, it's just live. So this is live Nord. Oops. Whatever I just spelled. Which means if I feed this into my inputs, which I think by default these are coming in 1 and 2, I'll double check. It's going to take this, a MIDI routing from the out of the 03, which for you guys would be from the out of your Inbox Pro, to the MIDI input of this keyboard, and then I need audio return to essentially feed me back. So audio is coming back out as an audio connector, 1/4 inch off the back. Actually, it's 3 and 4. So I'm just going to set up for this little guy. And now what I get to do is I get to actually use the sound source of the Nord, and I can use any sounds off of there, even though I generated all my MIDI in Pro Tools using these fun little things. So let me just set this up real quick. There it is, control. Hold on, I might have to go to the I might actually have to go to this thing here and tell it to accept channel 1, which is the other interesting part about this. Now this particular device, obviously some of the benefits from it are really the fact that we get to do a lot of manipulation of the sound right off of this particular unit. All right, so kind of nice, you know, because that means now we could technically, we could route to any external keyboard that actually uses, or synthesizer that actually uses some sort of MIDI input, because it means that now we can route any of the stuff that we've already built in and really get into manipulating sounds in the post, which is a huge benefit. More than just being able to record at home on a controller and having a lot of stuff in the box, we could essentially create a whole session, and if we wanted to, which some people do, you know, realistically, we could go rent out a studio that has a sick array of synths and just go blast through them essentially with our MIDI and track all of it. Now in this format, we're using an aux input. And an aux input, if you have never used it in this way, shape, or form before, will not go to print unless you go and bounce to disk. When you bounce to disk, anything you hear, so I don't know if you knew this, but when you bounce to disk, typically anything you hear, if you've selected your source as analog 1 and 2 or the main mix output, anything you hear will end up in the bounce. which means if you go aux on all of these, they will all end up in the bounce. You follow me on that? Otherwise, they're not put to print any other way, shape, or form. So a lot of times if you're in a situation where you're like, hey, I only have this for this one day, instead of doing it as an aux, just do it as audio tracks and you'll just put it to print right away. Does that make sense? Now, in addition to what's going on here, I'm going to add one more thing. Pick one of your, let's see. Okay, let's do it like this. Here's what we'll do. Take all of your inserts off so that you do not have any inserts. Follow me on that so far? Here's what we're going to do, and we're just going to be a little late starting our break because I want to show you this. I want you to create a multi-channel plugin that says instrument, reason, and I want you to make, I would like for you to make at least 4 of them. So go ahead and make 4 virtual instrument tracks and essentially put 4 reason plugins on it. If it asks you for a password, just type student. It'll ask you twice, you'll just do it twice. It'll open. So we want at least 4 tracks to have it. I'm going to make my whole thing have it for me. And you can just do option drag. Whoops. All right, now when you're in Reason, once Reason opens, here's what I would like for you to do when Reason is open. How many of you have Reason open? Anybody have Reason open? Reason's not open yet? It's still firing. It's doing its thing. For those of you who actually opened it up with data in it, go ahead and highlight, and if you have any devices in there when you opened it, highlight them and clear them. Is Reason not open for you, or is it open right now? Oh, okay. All right. Well, I don't know. Does anybody not have Reason open right now? Did you select a Rewire? Is it doing it? David? Did it show that it was opening at all? Here, hit Command Tab. Okay, hit it one more. Hit it until it was there. Oh, it is open. It's just not. Okay, hit File, hit New. Just hit New Session. Yeah, just hit New. Okay. Eros, you don't have it, or you do? Reason? Okay. So go into Reason, please, real quick. What we're going to do is we're going to set this up so each track in Pro Tools will only call to one device in Reason at a time. Okay? This is probably the most, well, it's not the most complex, but this is one complex way to set this up. There is an easy way to set Reason up, so it's just a single feed, a single stereo feed, and you run everything through it. A lot of people do it that way. But what if we want all our MIDI data, because here's what most people run into. Most people like using Reason for its ability to sequence and do devices and all that stuff. Some people prefer to do their MIDI in Pro Tools. Did you catch me there? I like to do both. It depends on what I'm doing, to be honest with you. If I like to see my MIDI side by side with my audio and I want to use Pro Tools, then I'll use Pro Tools. If not, if I just want to do standalone in Reason, I'll do standalone in Reason because I can always export the MIDI or do whatever the heck I want later. Depends on what I'm doing, you know. If I'm in a car riding with some friends and I don't want to hear them talking all day, I'll go to Reason and I'll do that standalone because I can do that really easily, and it takes so little DSP power, and I don't have to run off an external hard drive. Otherwise, when I'm running a whole bunch of Pro Tools stuff, sometimes I'll have to go external hard drive. I'll have to have the right interface. What you may or may not have realized about Pro Tools, when Pro Tools is in the Pro Tools aggregate mode, actually probably most of you have not realized this. When Pro Tools operates with no interface, it will require more CPU power and it will have a lower CPU usage limit. Which means if you stack up tracks, it'll need a higher buffer rate in order to keep up with you at a sooner time. Much faster than if you had an interface. So in some interfaces, depending on what type of interface it is and what they do, some interfaces actually have additional DSP power. So you might actually gain more by having an interface. So that's why sometimes when I'm on the road, I'd rather use Reason because it requires less power in the first place. We're going to go ahead and create. Please create for me. Actually, just create this whole list right here. See this whole list? Just make the whole list. It's not going to kill you. Alright, here's what happens. When you are done creating your whole list, hit Tab to flip you around to the back of Reason. I would like for you to do the following. You're going to route the outputs of each of these devices to their own number system on the output rack here. Essentially, this blue section is showing you how to get to your outputs. Normally, if you were just doing a stereo thing, and they're all getting summed to stereo, they'll just go to 1 and 2. But in this instance, we're just going to start feeding everybody to their particular specific number of outputs. So I'm going to skip number 2 because the first unit's in mono. But I'm going to go, the first unit will go to 1. The next set of units on its audio output, I'm looking for audio output left and right. Main output, here it is for the mouse drum, main output left and right. I'm going to send it to 5 and 6. I'm just going to keep going down, find all the outputs, make sure these outputs get routed to their own separate output setup over here. And so on and so forth. So this audio output is 1 and 2, which is left and right. They all kind of look different. They all have kind of a different scheme. If you're not used to this might be your first go around with this. Just try to find the main outs or your stereo outs left and right, or worst case scenario, some sort of 1 and 2 format for output. You're just going to drag these outputs. If you drag the left one of these outs, if you drag the left one, it'll automatically connect the right one. What was the first thing you created? Oh, but it must have, for some reason, it left this unit. Yeah, there's no, this one's mono, so that's fine. For these, for everything else, it should be stereo. I'm just going to connect them to the next set. Just keep going through it. All right, I'm gonna probably have to say this twice anyway, so I'm not afraid. Okay, so I'm gonna, for those of you who are already done, how many of you already done routing the Reason rack? Okay, I'll wait just a second. Anybody else? Basil, are you doing okay? Or you
No, I've never
Oh, okay, yes, you're gonna go to the blue. This won't be active. We won't use any of this stuff on the left. So you're gonna these are your next set of outputs. You're gonna route them to 3 and 4. So just go from left to 3. Yep. Next one. There you go. And then go down to this one and find its output. It's right here. Go from left, which will be to 5, and it's gonna route the right for you automatically. You just keep going down. Yeah, just go other outputs and route that way. You good?
Yeah.
Everybody's good? I mean, you guys are good? I said, David, you're doing good? Yeah, CJ. Huh? Oh, that's fine. Oh, hi, click it. Click it. Okay, and hit delete on your still. Or yeah, you can delete it from there if you want. You see where it says delete? Oh yeah, just hit there. It'll ask you, hey, do you want to hit turn? There you go. Yep. Looks like, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're getting close. You guys are pretty good. Okay, now here's where it really gets integrated, okay? Now, use this. How many of you have been up since this morning? Okay. I've been up since this morning, so I know exactly how it is. Tomorrow, Of course, I have meetings all day, but at least one day of the week I sleep in until an insanely, I sleep in as much as you do on one given day, because every other day I'm up way early in the morning and I have to still teach night class. And so I have a couple days like this, which really suck for me, so I'm sorry if, I'm probably better well rested than you are still, because yesterday was my sleeping day, so, so hey, if you ever get a chance, take a sleeping day. Just don't do it while you're supposed to be in class. But for those of you who have any ability to do this, okay, right now, try to do your best. Connect the dots with me real quick, okay? What we're gonna do is each device that you created in Reason, there's 2 steps. 2 steps. And you might want to make sure you know these or write them down. There's going to be 2 steps to linking all these devices to Pro Tools, okay? Now, you're going to learn about this in Audio 235 in your sound design and synthesis class, because this gets kind of complicated and it gets a little dodgy, and once you screw it up, you're kind of up a creek and then you have to start all over, and it's just easier to get the first time. So I want to help you get this not only the first time, but every time after. Okay, here's the thing. Okay, this isn't part of the steps, okay? This is crucial. Remember how when we open Pro Tools, we can't have any other DAW open? We cannot have Reason open before Pro Tools. If we do, it will not even show up in that plugin list that we saw. So we have to have Pro Tools open first, and then we can pull it down on the plugin and it'll open it automatically. Now Rewire, so catch me on this part. Rewire is a plugin that will interface essentially the audio outputs, not MIDI. No MIDI information is transferred via Rewire. Follow me on this one. Got me so far? So Rewire, the plugin, is only responsible for the audio. And so Rewire, being only responsible for audio, will have to and will respond essentially, it will respond to audio only, meaning what we're going to do is, see how we filled in? I don't know how many you ended up making or how many you ended up filling, but that is our audio return path on a number by number basis. So when we go to Pro Tools in the Rewire plugin, we're going to see that we have the opportunity to do any configuration, if it's mono or if it's stereo, and map out which channels go where from an audio standpoint. So that's audio only. Okay, so we'll handle audio only and it'll be step 1. Step 2 will be MIDI routing. So step 1, follow with me here. You will actually have to keep in mind and keep track of who is where on the Reason device, where it's routing to when you get into Pro Tools, but essentially you're going to go to the mix window and pick your first Reason Rewire, and it's going to say mix left right. Well, mix left right essentially is just 1 and 2. It essentially is the audio path of 1 and 2. Okay. If you go to the next one, you could just make it 3 and 4. So go to your next channel, go to your next Rewire, make it 3 and 4. Go to your next one and make it 5 and 6. Now, for me, I made a bunch of mono ones, so mine are gonna not really be stereo.
The first one, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, first one you'll leave the same. And then every one after that, you're going to follow with the number series, and you're just going to go down the list until you run out. Either you'll run out, or you'll make enough tracks to accommodate it. Right now, I'm only showing you this as an example, so I only asked you to make at least 4, so you can do this at least 4 times, and you can see it take place at least 4 times. So, do me a favor and make sure that you actually are seeing your audio outputs and you have those manipulated and changed. Raise your hand if you already did this. How many of you are done with the Rewire audio portion? So step 1. Yeah? Yeah? Okay, so CJ, you're still doing yours, huh? If you did it mono, if you made mono channels, it'll just be a single list. So that's because that's a mono channel. And it's okay, just make it the next number, whatever the next number was. You could have made them, yeah, you could have made them stereo. And that's fine. Now, so here's the problem, okay? We just did the audio path. Follow me there? We will now do the MIDI path, but it is possible to crisscross them. So we're using instrument tracks. We could have used MIDI tracks only for the MIDI side and used aux inputs for the audio side and had two different sets of tracks. One for sending MIDI and one for receiving audio. But instead we're using an instrument track which will do both in one channel, or basically both in one track. It'll both send MIDI and it will receive audio. So you catch me on this? So the important part is we want to connect on the same track where there's MIDI. We want to make sure that whatever channel input path is coming from Reason, essentially as an output, that matches up with what we pick in our MIDI routing list. And this is how it works. If we now go to MIDI routing, whether in a MIDI track or in an instrument track, now we will get a listing above here that shows everything we just opened up. You see this? It shows on a MIDI output. It now shows everything that we opened up in Reason. So now you just need to know which devices are on which channels, and then you can essentially route them. Now, you'll see hardware interface. The hardware interface actually won't count. So just FYI, and these channel numbers, hey, just make sure you're with me on this. These channel numbers, these are MIDI channel numbers. These are not track channel numbers or output channel numbers. These are MIDI channel numbers. So if you wanted to set them to specific channels, you'd have to route, specific channels to be the input for it. But since we're doing all, you're just using one controller, and that one controller will record to those specific channels. So you're going to go ahead and select in order your list. I know for a fact that we started on Subtractor, we went down into the Maelstrom and so on and so forth. So watch. I'm going to go ahead and route my first set. So this is where I'm going to have MIDI room. And if I can Reason, I can see I'm running off of this device. Essentially keep matching these up in their particular order that you had created them in Reason. So you'll just want to keep track of who's who and in what order. Oh, it looks like Thor's number 2, so Maelstrom's going to go to number 3. Or essentially, Maelstrom's 5 and 6. Okay, so good news about what this really means is now with this kind of configuration, and in any way, shape, or form you would like to create it, so you can make any numerous devices in Reason and use them across into Pro Tools. Now you get to use Pro Tools editing formats, do all your MIDI in Pro Tools. You can use takes like you're used to in Pro Tools. Essentially, you can use all the tools of Pro Tools, and you'll actually record to Pro Tools, and the only thing that we'll be responsible for when we see Reason is the sound engine, and that's it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So if you're, essentially this gives you the ability to be able to do all your live audio tracking in Pro Tools, and then do in addition to and add Rewire to give you Reason. Now Rewire, we don't have it. We don't actually have these other systems here, but Rewire will rewire to things like Ableton Live and all sorts of other DAW systems and all sorts of other MIDI sequencing systems. So you can use other software to rewire in the same manner, essentially. You're just having to make sure that the outputs routing from whatever the device is match the inputs coming in onto the rewire, and that the MIDI I/O is set up correctly so it configures with the outputs of the devices. So here's what I'm going to do. You guys can keep your Reason engines as part of your MIDI setup for now, for the time being. But what I want to show you is I just want to make sure you have a really pretty firm concept of what the majority of these elements are that we can do with MIDI in terms of actual manipulation of the sound. So I'm going to jump in here. We did last week, we did step input. I'm going to go to event. So please go to event with me in Pro Tools. And I want to point out a couple things. If we go down to MIDI real-time properties, you get this giant window and it's essentially giving you the ability to have this as a standalone window instead of having to do all of these things in the event operations. Essentially, it's the majority of what you see here, but it's in a more broken down element that shows you real-time properties, which basically mean live, okay? And these are all performance properties. See where it says apply to, and then it says blah, blah, blah? Essentially what we want that to be is we want that to be one of your MIDI tracks. So if you click in the nameplate of a MIDI track that you're going to record on, preferably one that either has a new playlist, so you could select right on the menu here, hit new to get a new playlist, or you can have it just be something you haven't recorded to yet. But if we can stick to a new track instead of just a clip, what we'll see if we open up each one of these windows. Input quantization, which is obviously the ability to snap to the grid. Duration for notes, minimum and maximum, meaning if you want to set up a duration for how long notes are played, that'll's there. Delay is set up so that you could either be ahead of time or behind time. Sometimes, for odd reasons, certain MIDI devices fire with more or less delay than others. So if you're using a lot of external devices, you might have to set up certain tracks so they have a certain amount of delay on them in order to compensate so that everybody comes in at the exact same time. You'll see velocity parameters if you want to. I use this sometimes because in Reason, the velocity sensitivity at above like 90% makes the piano, like if you play a grand piano, it makes it kind of harsh. So sometimes I'll use this and I'll say, hey, let's set my maximum value at maybe 110 and essentially give that range. Or you can just go here and say, let's do 90% only. And essentially that will keep it capped off from you ever having the ability to accidentally hit it too hard or give it too much. On the flip side, you could also do minimum velocities and apply those as well. And then live transposition. Live transposition is awesome because, let's see if my keyboard is still intact here. If I only know how to play in the key of C, okay, which a lot of people are that way, but that's not necessarily. Although I am on I don't have any polyphony on my. Let me switch to a different device real quick. Actually, I'll just route, instead of this being my subtractor, I will go to my in something. 19, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sorry, I'm just going to change this. 2, 3, 4, 5. Real quick. Okay, so if I switch this to piano, essentially I have the ability to play the same, whatever my comfortable key range is, and I can set these off. So if I want to be up a couple or down a couple, I'm still just playing the same stuff right now. You know, that way I can just play whatever's comfortable for me. Does that make sense? Now these are live properties, which means if I do transposition live, it means that it will actually manipulate the MIDI. So the MIDI will be recorded to the transposed MIDI performance that I am asking to. Does that make sense? This saves a lot of steps if you know you're going to do this in the end. This saves a lot of steps to do it in the pre, especially quantization, which of course will give you the ability to apply specific quantized parameters and give you the ability to even adhere to some swing so it's not all too stagnant. Now, quantization works like this. Most of you understand quantization meaning snap to grid, correct? Yeah? Now, here's the contingency. How you determine on a live input quantization, how you determine how much to quantize is based upon your fastest value. And if, let's say the tempo or the BPM has your quarter note looking like this. If all I'm going to play is something like that, and it's going to be with the quarter note, I can quantize to quarter note because it's the fastest thing I'm going to do. If I'm going to do faster and do subdivisions of that, something faster, I might go into 8th or 16th. Now, here's the plus and minus, the positives and negatives of that. If I go to 16th, for instance, it will still capture anything I meant to put on a quarter note. But if I'm closer to the late 16th than the on-time 16th, or closer to the early 16th than the on-time 16th for what I meant, it will snap to one of those previous. Is the downside. But a lot of times, 8th and 16th, like I'll do a lot of 8th input quantization or 16th input quantization, because I'll still be able to get away with essentially having it land on time. 32nd and beyond, that's when it gets too refined and too small that you're pretty much better off without quantization at all. Does that make sense? Now, these parameters are here to assist you and give you the ability to just, knock off a performance within a matter of minutes without having to do a whole bunch of, essentially practicing or really much of anything. And that's why they actually exist the way they do. While we're here, I do have to make mention of a couple of things that are not necessarily the most fun. We did pre-roll and post-roll last week. We just need to, while we're here, talk about in the event section, time and tempo operations. If you go to event and go to time operations, please. Change meter will give you a subdivision difference of 4/4 to something like swung like 6/8, like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 kind of feel. It will also give you the ability to change the what the BPM equals. Is it quarter note or is it eighth? It'll actually ask you where do you want it to start and be changed to and for how long. You could highlight this and apply it. Also realign the meter ruler or realign the whole thing, the chord numbers, the key signature, the bar markers. A lot of times you want it to do that. A lot of times you do not want to let it just do meter only because if you already had markers or anything written up in the information, it will leave them in the original spot and change the tempo without it or change the marker setting without it. So your downbeats might fall on offbeats if it's a meter change. Pretty easy to do. Insert time. Insert time is a real basic function, but let's just say this happens to me a lot. When you guys get to recording albums, this will happen a lot more than now. And what'll happen is you might have recorded an entire session, okay? So pretend my little MIDI thing here is an entire session. Full band, full whole shebang. We spent a whole week on this, one song or whatever. Now we're ready to put this song in conjunction with a bunch of other songs. And the artist decides, hey, we would like a little bit of lead time in the front of this song so we can just do maybe like a little pad or weird synth transition or some reverses. And essentially, all you need is some time on the front end. And that's where insert time really easily comes in. You could also insert time in the middle of a bar if you needed to add an extra phrase. But essentially what you get to do out of this is if you select at the beginning and say, hey, let's insert a couple bars, it's going to say how many. And let's say we only did 8, and then hit apply. It's just going to back the whole thing off and give us an extra 8 bars at the beginning. And it's going to renumber all the bars. It shouldn't move any markers, but it should renumber the bars. Obviously, you'll get a renumbering of time. But that's what that's there for. And inversely, cut time is the basic opposite. So you highlight a section and say, hey, I want to cut this time, and hit apply. You can get rid of that extra space as well. Also in time operations, move song start. Song start is more of the numbering of where the beginning of the counting actually takes place with the minutes and seconds and bars and beats. So if you actually wanted to move your start, it's going to actually renumber from a specific point. So move start to, let's say we wanted to go to bar 8. You know, essentially it's going to throw the start at bar 8, and look what it does to the other half of things from a bar perspective. Notice everything else is now in negative bars. If I had done that in minutes and seconds, and I said, let's move to let's do 22, and hit apply. Notice we end up with, it's going to throw us there, but it's going to leave our minutes and seconds at a 0 count from the beginning. And let's see all. Yes, sir.
Could you just highlight the tracks you wanted to move and then move them over?
Yeah, but you know, the only reason that gets dodgy is when you move tracks, unfortunately, the automation for certain things will not carry over. Automation for the tracks will go. But if let's say you did automation for auxes that went along with the tracks for submixes, or if you did something on something that didn't hold any audio, those won't move. They'll stay in their original position, which is why this is beneficial, just because data purposes.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if there is no automation, absolutely, just grab it and move it. Not a big deal. Now, but here's the other catch. Song start is when you hit return and you are returned to 0, in a bar beat, if you're using bar beats as your main counter, your return to 0 now switches to wherever the song start is moved to. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
So that's another thing that goes with it. If you go to minutes and seconds, it'll literally go back to 0. But so that's one extra thing. Great question though. Fantastic question. Now, that takes us into tempo operations. In tempo operations, we're given the ability, and I'm gonna show you some things, but we're given the ability to make changes for our tempo. I would like for you to, at the top of your edit window, open up this little drop-down menu for tempo, where it shows a tempo editor. You should see just basically this little section here. When you make a selection, and you decide you want to move things or adjust things on a constant tempo, all you have to do is say from where to where, and it's going to make a tempo change, and I'm just going to enter in a new BPM and hit return and hit apply. And what it's going to do is it's going to change it for that duration. Well, the only problem is if you want it to hold that duration for the rest of the song, sometimes you'll have to, if you want it to hold, the original tempo for the rest of the song, you'll have to hit preserve tempo. Notice there is also an advanced information here where it says calculate tempo, calculate samples. And what it's going to show you essentially is it's going to show you if we make a change here, and I'll tell you why. When we get to Elastic Audio, this is going to be a bigger deal. If we make a change here, how many samples are included? If we make essentially a tempo adjustment at this point in time, and that's what this is really calculating for. And that's why you see this in samples, because when we start doing stuff with Elastic Audio, essentially it's going to require that we take into consideration what our original sample rate was and how many samples we're manipulating in that formula. Now linear, if we go to linear, what it's going to say is, hey, let's let's create a situation where the tempo will drastically increase, but it will do it in an even amount of time. So in linear tempo changes, you see this right here, it basically made it so the tempo adjusts slowly and up and into the final destination, and then it hangs on to it afterwards. If we go on to parabolic, you have the ability to change this shape. So notice down here you have this slider, which gives you the ability to change how fast or slow. So if we decided we wanted to make this gradual at the beginning, but then more drastic at the end, or vice versa. Are you guys seeing this? What that means is if you're using click, it'll make that click go to that tempo. If you were doing MIDI, if this was like a MIDI and you had done like some sort of string orchestration, that MIDI information would now flow to this new tempo. And of course, it would basically just follow suit with what you've already told it to do, but it will be now tempo mapped. And then you'll see there are a couple other options: the S curve, scale, and stretch. Stretch has to be stretch to 12. Stretch gives you the ability to, if your downbeat has not, if you're doing this in the post specifically, or if in the pre your downbeat's just not, it's like you've made it so that it's accurately doing everything evenly in terms of changing time, but for some reason you're like, oh, it's so close, but it needs to essentially be just a little bit deeper. The downside to it is, since it's operating on a grid, it will function with a certain bit of consistency, so you might end up having to manipulate it in the stretch form, which will adapt only the selected range that you've picked and either expand it or shrink it. Now, an addendum to all that, you could literally just come in here with your grabber tool and start sliding these around and put them to the exact positions that you wanted to, overall. And you could as well take the pencil tool and start drawing them in using the same kind of forms and functions, and you'll see down below, you'll see the parabolic, which we just saw as a tempo change option. And you'll also see a lot of these basic types, the S curve, and then of course just standard freehand, which is just anything you want. But this is going to become, ultimately this is going to become really important in about 30 minutes. All right, any questions on that? Yes, sir.
Could you do the tempo monitor? Could you do it on just one track, or is it going to do it on all the tracks that's under that tempo change?
Yeah, it's going to do it to the whole thing. It will be a global change, but you can decide who you want to adhere to the tempo. It just means that you can't decide you can't decide specifically if anybody else is not adhering to tempo. You can't really go in and individually say, well, you're going to be this tempo, you're going to be that tempo, and you're going to be this tempo. Unfortunately, you can't do that. You really can only say, hey, everybody, you can be this tempo, or you can choose to be whatever original tempo you were recorded at. Yeah. Now, we're going to get into Elastic Audio and talk about MIDI events and how they adhere to this tempo in a bit. But the first things first, I need you to very quickly begin work on it is exercise 4. It's MIDI recording. This is in your book. I'll hit the light so you guys can start. This is actually a really quick. This thing doesn't. It's not a long one. But if you guys can rock this out, turn it into me on the share drive. Hopefully in the next 20 minutes or so, we'll pick up with Elastic Audio and we'll get to the rest of our fun night.
What page is it?
E4-3.
Start with 4.
Okay, here we go. So this is what's going on. This is all MIDI, and it's just cueing to specific sounds inside of Reason. You know, so this is just a specific piece of MIDI. Well, what I've done with this, using Elastic Audio, is I've imported a drum track, and I'll import it again so you can see it. This session is set to 136, and what I did is I went ahead and imported a drum track from a totally different song, and I went ahead and added it, and watch what happens. Comes in at its own tempo. So if I solo this, way off, because it's, first of all, it's not gridded, but it also does not start on tempo. So what I'm going to do to create Elastic Audio essentially is go to ticks on the audio, and I'm going to take this into a rhythmic format because it's a drum rhythm. And then I'm going to right click on the track, and notice what it says down here. Conform to tempo. This is going to take it from its original tempo and make it be this new tempo. And now I'm going to do another little trick that we got called tab to transient, which is this little thing here. It's called tab to transient. And I'm going to tab until I hit my first transient. And then what I'm going to do, that means my first hit. I'm going to hit this shift return. You guys should know because we talked about this, but shift return selects from the location that I'm at all the way to the beginning. Exactly. All I'm going to do is hit delete, and I'm going to shuffle it so that it snaps to the first grid selection right there. Now another thing that's taking place is I need to figure out how this rhythm starts when the transient does come in, and I find the first downbeat. Okay, so there's my downbeat right here in the middle. And all I'm going to do is pick the place that I'd like for the drums to come in. And for this particular selection, I think I'm going to wait, like I ended up doing here when I prepped this a second ago. I'm going to just wait a bar so that, you know, these guys will do their thing. Are going to go and do their own thing. So what I'm going to do is, just like we did last week, all I'm going to do is make this a little group like we did last week, but I'm going to put it right here on this 4-bar phrase. And I'm going to go clip, group, and then I'm going to go clip, loop, and I'm going to say, hey, let's loop a bunch of times, and please enable crossfades between the loops. And it's going to go ahead and basically loop this for the duration that I asked it to. And then all I have to really do is go in here and go, okay, well, where's the end of this selection? You know, it looks like it just dies off right here, so that's cool. And I'm just going to get rid of it. Whoops, not for that much, but for this duration. And there are a couple other variations of the drums that take place in there, but essentially you're seeing how Elastic Audio allows us to conform to tempo. Well, the good news about this is that until I go to print with this, I actually am not fixed on my tempo. So as long as I'm in Elastic Audio here, and notice, since I'm using MIDI here, essentially it always uses tick-based time, so it will modify, meaning if I zoom out and I want to make a different tempo, 136 is my guy right now. let's say I just do 150. You see what just happened? The other kit didn't conform because it's an audio form. It's not in the elastic audio property right now. But now you're seeing both MIDI and audio essentially jumped with this. This takes us to tempo mapping, which we were just talking about a while ago.